Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on this Monday evening, I'm joined by the one and only Grace Blakeley. Grace, great to have you back on the show. How are you doing? How have you been?
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm really good, thank you. It's been a lovely sunny day in Cornwall.
Yes, you've moved to Cornwall.
Yeah.
Sorry, we haven't seen each other in ages.
Yeah.
Well, we won't do too much of a catch-up, but you've moved to Cornwall because you're a surfer now.
Yeah, Michael, you're always welcome to come and visit me down here.
I'd love to.
It is a lovely break from the horrors of London and politics in general. And yeah, the surf is great, as is the cold water swimming. I had a nice dip this morning.
Wow, I bet your immune system is fabulous and your mental health just seems
sure
top-notch. Yeah, wow, glowing. Unbelievable. I'm feeling bitter and resentful, but I'm genuinely happy for you. Me and Grace are going to be talking about some of the latest from Gaza over the weekend, and Gary Stevenson on Piers Morgan debating Dave Rubin is his name, which is going to give me and Grace also an opportunity to talk about wealth inequality and taxation, one of our favourite topics. Stay tuned for all of that. Germany's centre-right Christian Democratic Party has won the most seats in the country's federal election, but the real story of the vote isn't in the centre. It's on the fringes, with both the populist right and the populist left making big gains at the polls. Let's start with the bigger picture. So the Conservative CDU took just under 30% of the vote. Its second worst result in history, but still enough for them to win. That just shows the fragmentation of politics at the moment. The far-right AfD, on the other hand, scored its best ever win at nearly 21%. Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats got just 16%, its worst defeat since 1887. The Greens, who were in coalition with Scholz, also lost support. They're down in fourth. Die Linke, or the left, got just under 9%, and newcomer Sarah Wagenknecht's BSW is on 4.97%, just under the 5% that you need to get into Parliament. And the Liberals there on 4.3% as well. So they also will not get any seats. The result is undoubtedly most significant for the AfD, which their leader, Alice Weidel, hammered home last night.
And as we've seen in the exit polls, what we've seen is that we are the only party who have doubled our position over the last election. Double. They wanted to cut our numbers in half, but the opposite is what has occurred. And one thing is for sure. We will always have an open hand to get involved in a coalition in the German government. The will of Germany is something we will implement. We are always prepared to fulfill the will of the people in a German government.
Alice Weidel is a lesbian with a Sri Lankan partner, so may not seem the natural leader of an anti-LGBT and anti-migrant party. Now, if you're watching this saying, well, why are you saying she's anti-LGBT? Well, the AfD's official platform says a family is a man, a woman and a child, and she's a woman with a female partner and a child. So it does seem quite strange as a combination. Also, of course, on many other issues, she is quite the extremist. She led chants for the remigration of immigrants at the party's most recent conference. But Weidel's stated willingness to enter into a coalition with the CDU is unlikely to be realised. That's because all the major German parties have said they will not work with the AfD. This is part of the so-called firewall around the far right, which has been sort of in place, a convention in German politics since the Third Reich, or the fall of the Third Reich, of course. The CDU are expected to therefore go into coalition with the SPD and potentially also the Greens. And this man, Friedrich Merz, looks set to be the country's next chancellor.
As soon as possible, we need to get a viable government together in Germany, a government capable of working based on a majority, because, ladies and gentlemen, the world outside is not going to wait for us.
One other party who were happy with their results, but who are very unlikely to go into any coalition with the CDU is Die Linke, or the Left Party. This might seem like a fairly dramatic celebration for a party who've just received under 9%. But it does make sense when you consider that just weeks ago they were polling below the 5% needed to have any presence at all in Parliament. And the party was credited with having a dynamic young leadership and a good social media campaign. Their rival on the left, the Sarah Wagenknecht party, missed the 5% threshold by just 0.3% of the vote, so won't be entering Parliament. So what's driven the rise of the right and left at the expense of the centre? Well, both the left and the right proved popular with younger voters. So the left party came out on top with under 25s on 25%. The AFD came second among under 25s with 21%. The left party's support dropped off as voters got older, so they were most popular with that youngest age group. The AFD, in fact, was most popular among millennials, my age group. The far-right party came top in both the 25 to 34 and 35 to 44 age brackets. High turnout also potentially boosted the AFD. 83% of the population voted on Sunday, which is the highest turnout since reunification. And according to exit polls, 2 million of those previous non-voters went to the AFD, which is much more than any other party. Potentially related, they also came top among working class voters. You can see however, time support for the traditional main parties has fallen among working class voters, while it has risen among the AFDs. They won 38%. I presume this is sort of the traditional definition of working class. Obviously, there are many different ways one can look at that. As for the issues that drove the AFD's support, this is from The Times. 55% of all voters said the AFD had understood better than the other parties that people no longer feel safe. It's about crime, I suppose, while 46% approved of the party's determination to curb the inflow of migrants, and 45% said Weidel clearly tells it like it is. Those issues seem to have mattered most in the east of Germany. As this map shows, the AFD dominated the former East Germany. The blue, covering almost all the east except Berlin, shows the districts where the far right came first, and the black and grey, covering nearly all of West Germany, or former West Germany, is where the CDU came out on top. Lastly, as I imagine you already know, the AFD, of course, also had support from the world's richest man. In the run-up to the election, Elon Musk hosted an interview with Weidel on X and spammed the platform with pro-AFD content. And just a month ago, he appeared virtually at this AFD rally.
This election is so important. It's extremely important. I do not say it lightly when I think the future of civilization could hang on this election. So when something is so important, you really need to say, okay, you've got to go all out to convince people to vote for AfD.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Someone has just pointed out in the chat that I said Sarah Wagenknecht's party missed out by 0.3%. It was, in fact, 0.03%. So much closer. My maths is not so good today, but thank you for that. I'm joined now by Loren Balhorn, editor-in-chief of Jacobin Germany and a member of Die Linke. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. We're going to discuss sort of Die Linke, your party, sort of their campaign, how it's worked out. The big issue, though, of this election is clearly the AfD doubling their support. I suppose, would you agree? Is that what we should be focusing on, really? Is the sort of danger of the AfD having doubled their support now presumably going to be the official opposition?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it depends on which hat I'm wearing. As a member of the left and an eternal optimist, I think we should be focusing on the extraordinary turnaround for the party. But yeah, I think any sober analysis from the left needs to proceed from that point of departure that the right now has over 20% of all voters, and perhaps not a majority, but a very dominates among both workers, unemployed, and large section or large groups of people who feel that they are facing economic difficulties. However they define that is a subjective question. But yeah, clearly the AfD is the protest party and the party of the unsatisfied and frustrated in Germany, and that's there's certain historical precedents there that should probably make us concerned.
And I mean, can you talk a bit about sort of the support for the AfD? So I've sort of said in my intro, they're more popular in the east of Germany, popular with working class voters. I suppose potentially surprisingly for a British audience, the age group in which they're least popular is over 70s. So they actually seem to be quite popular among working age populations. we're used to in this country, sort of it being older people who, on average, vote right wing. That doesn't seem to be the case in Germany.
That's partially true. Old people, or older people, I should say, maybe don't vote for the far right, but they still vote for the center right in droves. I think, in Germany, for specific historical reasons, there is perhaps still more of a sensitivity among the older generation to not vote for a party that doesn't have any institutional continuities with the Nazis, but in terms of its rhetoric, particularly its far right wing around Björn Höcke, is more than willing to play with Nazi vocabulary or Nazi phraseology. There's more of a reluctance on the older generation to vote for that, whereas among young people and working age people, I guess that taboo is no longer as strong, but also the AfD does a very good job of relating to the anger and frustration that many working class people and young people feel. Obviously, they relate to that anger and take it in a grotesque direction, and their politics offers nothing that would improve the lives of working class people materially. But simply in terms of affect, in the way they address voters, in the way they deploy humor and sarcasm, they manage to relate to young people in a way that until very recently, no other party could. I think that's one of the silver linings of this election, is the extent to which the left has managed to make up some of that lost ground, particularly among young voters, and adopt a tonality that speaks to millennials and Generation Z much more than maybe previous iterations of the party could.
This firewall, is that definitely going to stand? I mean, as far as I understand it, sort of most people are saying the AfD won't enter government now, but maybe in 2029. Is there a sort of scenario where Merz actually sort of says, oh, the SPD wouldn't agree to what I wanted, or the Greens wouldn't agree, so therefore, maybe I am going to give the AfD a second look?
Well, I mean, that's what we just saw happen in Austria. That then also failed simply for, frankly, out of sheer luck that the far-right party was unable to reach a coalition agreement. I don't think there's any danger of that happening in Germany right now, largely because Merz is the leader of the CDU. He enjoys broad support, but there are still wings of the party for whom a government with the AfD would be too much to stomach. And although I don't think that Merz personally would really have any qualms with joining with the governing with the AfD, he would not be keen to split his own party and go down in history as the man who split Germany's strongest and most stable moderate party. Thus, I think predictions that there will be no AfD government before 2029 are accurate. What could happen between then is anyone's guess. We could maybe see, maybe on the state level, for example, we could see AfD joining governments, particularly in the East. But I think unless the center continues to hollow out and perform significantly less in 2029, which is not only possible, but likely, I think until then, we'll see the AfD stay government, but really go from strength to strength in every election until then.
Let's talk about your party then. So people have seen sort of the joyous celebrations at, I suppose it was their victory party or their rally or whatever. And someone might say, they didn't get they were below 9%. Why did they look so happy? I suppose, can you explain the context whereby this is seen as a real victory for Die Linke?
Well, I mean, you have to remember 3.5 years ago, the last federal election, Die Linke, following months of steadily declining polls, Die Linke got actually a remarkably similar result to that of Sarah Wagenknecht's party, this time around 4.9%, and only managed to stay in parliament through a loophole that allows parties that win 3 or more direct seats to establish a parliamentary group despite missing the threshold. So compared to that result in 2021, it is a major improvement, but it's particularly a major improvement over last year in the European elections, where Die Linke dropped below 3%. And after basically 2 years of Die Linke steadily polling around 3%, and quite frankly, large parts of the party, I think, at least quietly, internally accepting the idea that the party would not remain in parliament and may not remain on the political scene at all in the medium term. So that kind of not only did we get our asses saved, so to speak, but almost doubled our results over last election, and seemed to suddenly have an incredible burst of forward momentum. I mean, the party is approaching 100,000 members now, larger than it's been since the 1990s. It's younger than it's ever been. It's more female than it's ever been. So beyond the actual elections, there are just a lot of reasons, I think, at the moment for party members, and particularly the new party leadership who's responsible for this turnaround, to feel confident about the future, despite the fact that the overall political situation is still quite grim.
Let's talk about the Sarah Wagenknecht party. So, context for our listeners, Sarah Wagenknecht was a leading member of Die Linke. She left, I think it was last year, wasn't it, to form this breakaway party. And this sort of represents also an ideological split on the left, because she is very much, let's lean left on the economy, but lean right when it comes to migration and social issues. She's also much closer to Russia than Die Linke. And then Die Linke is sort of, it's now, I suppose, gone in a more unashamedly sort of liberal, pro-migrant direction now that that wing has gone in another direction. My question for you, she got 4.97% when the threshold to enter parliament was 5%. Are you, as a Die Linke member, pleased that she didn't meet the threshold? Or would you have liked to have seen the BSW in parliament as well?
I wouldn't say I'm pleased, no. I will say that and I do not belong to members of the party who consider the the BSW to be right wing or far right. I also think it's not helpful to describe them as being pro-Russian. I think that their policy or their position is clearly anti-NATO. You could maybe argue that they exhibit a certain understanding for Russia's security concerns. But nevertheless, that said, I do think that the move on migration, I think it's one thing to say the left does itself no favors by emphasizing migration and open borders, because those are not winning issues. I think that Sarah Wagenknecht was right when she said that when she was in the party, and I think that that is still true today. But I think there's a lot of space between not emphasizing migration and actively repeating the talking points and the rhetoric of the right, which especially over the last 3, 4, 5 months, Wagenknecht has leaned into very hard. And not only Wagenknecht, but also other members of her party. I feel, at least rhetorically, and you can make a very clear case that they're not copying AfD slogans, but they are parroting right-wing talking points, presumably with the idea that this will somehow win over frustrated working class voters who've been lost to the far right. But as the election results, I think this time around show, that doesn't work out in the long term, because those voters, ultimately, most of them will prefer to vote for the original. And I think this time around, especially if we contrast that to the European elections last year or the state elections last fall, the sort of two key issues that the BSW has done a pretty good job of distinguishing themselves around: the war in Ukraine, the refusal or the rejection of weapons shipments to Ukraine, and migration, were no longer particularly polarizing topics, or rather, the Ukraine war had largely receded into the background. And around migration, we had a repolarization with basically every party except for Die Linke accepting or supporting increased restrictions on migration, and I think more critically, restrictions on the right to asylum, which gave Die Linke a very easy opportunity to position itself as the only party pushing back against this drift to the right and standing up for the right to asylum. Whereas BSW, its position wasn't particularly right-wing, but it also no longer stood out in a field where every party is falling over each other to increase deportations and militarize the border. So in that sense, their kind of unique selling points were no longer very relevant. And I think, yes, the wager that you can adopt conservative positions on some questions and progressive positions on others ultimately was not enough At least wasn't enough for 5%. I wouldn't say it's completely failed. There's still a very strong result last year. Politics can move quickly, 13,000 more voters than they would be in parliament. But it seems like the wager this time around, failed.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk about sort of the strategy, that, you know, because there's perennial debate on the left about sort of how do you defeat the far right. And there's one side which says you've got to be uncompromising on cultural issues, don't concede on migration, don't concede on any of these various issues that, you know, our audiences will be familiar with. And then there's the other position, which was more the Sarah Wagenknecht one, which is saying, you know, if you want to peel people away from the far right, you have to compromise on some of those social issues, right? And maybe still be left-wing populist or economically populist, but sort of concede on those. And lots of people have been looking at these election results and saying, aha, this proves that strategy one is correct because Die Linke have done better than the Sarah Wagenknecht party, which sort of has some merit to it. But I want to show you a graphic before I get your answer. I want to show you this graphic, which sort of I found quite useful. So it's where each party's extra voters came from. So votes for the AfD came from non-voters, the CDU, the Liberals, some from the SPD. The CDU mainly got votes from the SPD. The Sarah Wagenknecht party got non-voters, some voters from the CDU, the Liberals, and the SPD, and then a small sliver from the AfD. But no one else got them from the AfD. They doubled their support, so presumably not many people left them. And the left mainly got votes from the Greens, and then some from the SPD.
Right.
And so I suppose my question for you is, if we face this situation in Europe and, you know, America or wherever, where sort of you've got this rising populist right, which is sort of challenging to win sort of majoritarian blocks and radically change politics, then how useful is it to have a party on the left that wins a bunch of voters from the Greens? You know, like it seems in a way, if the real priority is how to face down the far right, voters shifting from the Greens to the left or the left to the Greens or the SPD to, you know, is it not almost, you know, I don't want to sound dismissive, but irrelevant if voters go from the Greens to the left?
In the big picture, probably. I would say in the immediate term, no, in the sense that I do think it is relevant to have a party in parliament, an opposition in parliament to the left of the Greens and you know, the SPD, or, you know, the extreme center, as Tariq Ali and others have called it. I do think it matters. I think that the presence of the party also means that certain arguments will be heard in the public sphere that otherwise wouldn't be. But when we're talking in terms of, you know, kind of building progressive majority or kind of rebuilding hegemony of socialist ideas, then obviously the result is much less impressive. And I think everyone with a stake in these arguments looks at every election result in Europe and takes that as confirmation that their strategy was correct. You know, we had the same kind of dynamic in Germany around, for example, Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, that both sides would refer to this success as evidence that their position was correct. So Bernie Sanders confirms the Sarah Wagenknecht people in that he doesn't emphasize migration and, in fact, opposes open borders. But at the same time, if you look at the messaging that he uses and the kind of diverse coalition that he seeks to project, the other side of the debate takes that as confirmation that they're correct, that you don't have to make any compromises. Indeed, compromises are problematic. So the same thing is now going to be happening with Anglo commentators looking at the election in Germany. I think an important point or thing to keep in mind is that it might be true that Die Linke, unlike Sarah Wagenknecht, did not chase the right on questions of migration. But if you compare this campaign to previous election campaigns, there was a much clearer focus on a few core issues: housing, cost of living, wages, two or three others, but really a much more focused kind of materialist campaign as opposed to previous years. And really the issue of migration and asylum only began to play a role in the campaign because of changes in the parliamentary debate, really, and Friedrich Merz's successful move to recruit or enlist the AfD to pass further restrictions on migration. But it was not, in this case, Die Linke pushing those issues to the fore. Die Linke was engaged in, I would say, what was in many ways a bread and butter campaign around material issues that affect working class people. And then nevertheless, when you break down the demographics of the vote, at least based on the exit poll data we have, most of the working class did not seem very interested in that message. Our results did improve among working class voters and did improve among trade unionists, but they're still far below the kind of percentages that we were reaching 15, 20 years ago. And there's still a lot of ground to be recovered in that area. But I don't think that you can draw too many definitive conclusions from one election, because building, or rebuilding a left mass movement is a 10, 20-year project. But I do think that if anything, this campaign, to the extent that this confirms or denies anyone's preconceived beliefs, it does confirm that a targeted bread and butter kind of material campaign or demands can win, or not win. I mean, 8% is not winning, but can gain traction among a significant part of the electorate, and that you don't have to actively run to the center on some other issues to win back working class voters. But how you go from 8 to 18 or 20, 30, 40%, that's anybody's guess. I don't think anyone in continental Europe has a good answer for that.
That was a very reasonable response. Difficult to argue with that. Loren Balhorn, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. Really good to talk to you. And congratulations for the 8.7%.
Nice to be here.
I don't want to downplay it, because it did surpass expectations, which is good to see. So thank you for that. Lots of people in the comments, I sort of said this chart explains everything, and then everyone's like, what the hell was that chart? It looks like abstract art. Can we bring it up one more time? Just so I'm going to go to Grace on this in one moment, but just because I think maybe I rushed through it and everyone just saw this sort of blur of lines. So I'll explain a bit more detail what this is showing. So on the right, you've got the parties, how they performed in 2025. And then on the left, you've got how people voted in 2021. And then what you're seeing between those is which voters changed. So you can see at the top, you've got people who didn't vote in 2021. Lots of them went to the AFD. Some of them went to the CDU. A few of them went to the BSW. Slightly less went to the left, slightly less went to the Greens, slightly less, or slightly more went to the SPD, I suppose. And then it's showing you where people have migrated from which party to which. So you can see lots of the SPD went to the CDU, lots of the FDB went to the CDU. The Greens mainly went to the left party. That's what I was showing you there. Let me go to Grace now. Grace, I know you've been following the German elections. What have you taken away from these results?
I've honestly been so shocked at the turnaround for Die Linke. I was in Germany just kind of as the election was announced, speaking at a conference of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which is an institution that's linked to Die Linke and whose funding is tied to Die Linke. And at that point, there was this huge concern that basically, Die Linke wouldn't get enough seats, and the Rosa Luxemburg, which, by the way, funds a lot of left-wing organizations in the UK and around the world, would lose some of its funding. And the turnaround from then has been really astonishing. The thing that I find most interesting about what's happened here is the story about the Die Linke and the BSW. The AfD has been surging for a very, very long time. We've known that. It's happening in Europe. It's happening all around the world. We know the reasons for this. It is disempowered, isolated people who are suffering from a long-standing cost of living crisis and feel like a political elite that has ignored them for decades can no longer be trusted. So they vote for kind of anti-status quo parties that they perceive as institutions that can go in and kind of shake things up. This was a trend that we've been seeing for a very, very long time. But the narrative was that Die Linke is going to get crushed under the weight of this shift, and they are going to be replaced to some extent by this party, the BSW, which is basically saying we have to concede to the concerns of working class voters on migration, and then offer them kind of more progressive economic policies to meet their concerns over the cost of living. This is a narrative that some people on the left all around the world are pushing right now. It's something that, for example, the Dutch left has tried. It's something that people here are arguing as a way of responding to reform. And it is based on a completely and utterly flawed understanding of why people are concerned about the issue of migration. People aren't concerned about migration because they think, well, I'd quite like my wages to go up, so I'd quite like progressive economic policies, but I just really hate migrants, and that outweighs everything else. They vote for far-right parties that have anti-migrant stances because everywhere they are hearing the message, you are poor because of migrants, right? And either you give into that message, in which case those people will vote for parties that are strongest on migration, because, the corollary, that way of thinking, is to say, well, if migrants are making me poor, the fewer migrants there are, the richer I'm going to be, right? Or you confront that and say the reason that you are poor is because we have an economic system in which, the wealthy get rich by you being poor. And it's also in their interests for you to believe that you are actually poor because of migrants. So this, I think, represents a real challenge to that narrative that you can offer people kind of, anti-migration stances alongside progressive economic policies. And more than that, it shows that this new kind of model of organizing that I think we're seeing among left-wing parties in lots of different places, but particularly across Europe. I'm thinking particularly of the Belgian Workers' Party, the Communist Party in parts of Austria, of getting into communities, building strong local campaigns based on a dedicated network of activists and really good candidates who are embedded in their communities. That is the only way that you're going to be able to fight back against those narratives, because basically people don't trust political elites. I would argue rightly so. And the left cannot come in and swoop in and just say, we have the answers to all your problems.
I mean, as far as I understand, I haven't been to Germany recently, but the Die Linke did well because they had a good social media campaign and won young people who would otherwise have voted for the Greens. Like that just doesn't strike me as a very successful, like a very meaningful anti-fascist sort of politics. Also, on the in terms of people who do,
it's not true. So if you look at the campaigns that have done particularly well, I remember when I was in Germany, a few people had put me in touch with a number of like really exciting candidates that they had in Berlin and in some of the big cities. And they were like, look, we're probably going to do really badly, but we're putting all of our effort and a lot of our activists into supporting these campaigns of like really good candidates. There's this guy, Ferhat Kokak, I think I'm pronouncing that right, who ran a really amazing campaign in Berlin. And that was all based around activists getting out, knocking on doors, talking to people, engaging in different forms of community organizing. When I was there talking at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and there was all this pessimism about what was going to happen at the general election, they were basically saying, look, we have to rebuild this party from the ground up. We have to make sure that we are in communities, talking to people, doing the things that I recently wrote about how the Belgian Workers' Party is doing this as well. It's kind of like that Black Panther approach of saying, right, we're not just giving people ideology, we're getting involved and, providing, food banks and community events and campaigns and helping people who want to, stop their pools and their libraries from being closed down. That kind of organizing, that's the only future really for genuine left parties, I would say. And I think Die Linke did a really good job of that in certain campaigns that they prioritized.
But they haven't won. I mean, from the chart I showed, it doesn't seem like they've won a single vote from people who would have otherwise voted for the right? If their votes have come from the Greens, like fair enough, that might give them a platform to sort of put forward a politics that the Greens wouldn't otherwise have done. But I don't think they haven't yet done anything that sort of undermined the rise of the AfD, because they're winning liberal left voters in Berlin. So I'm just not sure how much
liberal left voters in Berlin. They've won voters from, as you've shown from that graph, from a number of different sources. But also, you have to remember the German Greens are not like our Greens. They are aggressively centrist, arguably like relatively right wing, and they've completely messed up over the course of of recent years by backing a lot of policies in the kind of classically blind centrist way of saying this is what we're going to do and we don't really care what the impact is on living standards. And as a result, they've lost a lot of votes, and the left has actually managed to exploit that collapse. And I don't think that's something that we should be worried about, the fact that Die Linke is picking up votes from people who are otherwise voting for a relatively centrist party. But it's also a wider story. It's not just they got votes from the Greens. They got votes from lots of people in lots of different places. And a big part of that was based on this just really powerful grassroots campaign. I think it's a similar story, to be honest, to what happened here in the last general election. The headlines are all going to be picking up on the fact that this political party, won the most votes or whatever. But the left's strategy of targeting particular areas with really strong campaigns with dedicated groups of local activists going and talking to people about the issues that they care about and saying, we're kind of invested in your local area and here's how. That's, I think, a similar sort of thing as what we've seen in Germany today. And of course, it's just a foundation, as Loren was just saying. They've got a huge amount of rebuilding to do. Bear in mind that, it was only a few months ago we basically thought Die Linke was on the verge of collapse. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen. There's new leadership, lots of new development. How they're going to put this new membership to work is really important. But I think this is a really good start and an indication, along with those other parties that I've mentioned, like, for example, the Belgian Workers' Party, of a winning strategy for the left.
What do you mean by a winning? I suppose this is a genuine question. What do you mean by winning strategy for the left? Do you mean sort of winning election or sort of seeing downright, or do you mean sort of getting 10 off? What does it mean?
We don't have a left-wing political party. What party in the UK would win an election for the left? There is none. What winning for the left looks like is building support for left policies. It involves, I would say, kind of expanding a network of organisers that can provide a foundation for an electoral political project that would hopefully take place at some point in the future. But right now we are building from an extremely low base, and we have to take that effort really seriously.
Yeah. What do you think about the Danish Social Democrats? They're the party, because whenever anyone says you can't possibly go, you can't be restrictionist on immigration and sort of social democratic in your economics and win. Denmark doesn't really have a successful right-wing populist party, partly because the Danish Social Democrats did that a while ago, right?
Yeah, I would say that was what I was going to say. But also the corollary is to look at the Dutch Social Democrats, which tried to do that, only to basically provide the foundations for the rise of the extreme right immediately after. So, it's just so very clear that if you center these issues around immigration and you reinforce the message to people, you are poor because of migrants, they are just going to vote for the party that gets rid of the migrants. If you're not able to challenge that economic messaging and saying, you're poor for these other reasons, and also the people who are making you poor want you to think that it's migrants so that you don't pay attention to them, then you're just going to play into the hands of the far right.
Yeah. So what should the migration policy be? Just because you're also talking about discourse there, right? So you're talking about sort of like what do you emphasize in your campaign?
The left is not in a position to really be, we're not in a position to be making policies, right? Not in the UK, not in most of Europe, because we are no way near to getting into government. What our strategy has to be about is making people feel empowered to resist the encroachment of their living standards right now. So that means, encouraging them to get involved in the labour movement, in various different forms of community organising, and also building a kind of foundation for shifting narratives on these issues so that hopefully we can start to rebuild again in the future. I don't think we really need to be going out there and saying this is what our policy is on migration. We need to be making sure that every intervention, one of the very, very tiny number of interventions that anyone on the left is able to make within British politics is about centering questions of living standards and also the grotesque unfairness and oligarchic nature of our political and economic system.
It's interesting. We'll come back to this, I'm sure. We've got you on quite a lot this month. I'm looking forward to it. 6 Israeli captives held by Hamas were released in Gaza on Saturday. 3 of them appeared on stage in the Nuzarat refugee camp in central Gaza before being handed to the Red Cross. 27-year-old Elia Cohen, 22-year-old Omer Shem Tov, and 23-year-old Omer Wenkert all appeared in good health. The 3 were taken hostage at the Nova Festival in October 2023. And there was one moment during that handover, though, that took everyone by surprise. So this was the moment that Omer Shem Tov, to the right of your screen, leaned across and kissed the head of one of his Hamas captors. And moments later, he did it again with a second Hamas fighter to cheers from the gathered crowd. Now, it's not unreasonable to imagine Shem Tov gave those kisses under duress. I mean, they were still hostage at that point, right? You shouldn't really take anyone at face value. In fact, also one Israeli media outlet has reported that on his return to Israel, Shem Tov said, quote, the dogs, Hamas, made me do it. I had no choice. That hasn't been verified by any other journalists. Others have argued that whether coerced or not, the political symbolism of the embrace is a blow to Israel's war machine. Former Al Jazeera correspondent Ahmed Shihab El-Din described the kiss like this. So he said, it was an unarmed act of war against the machine of dehumanization, a glitch in the algorithm of propaganda, a trembling disruption in the cold calculus of who is allowed to be seen as human and who must remain the ungrieved dead. The question is not whether Omer Shem Tov pressed his lips to the forehead of a Hamas fighter out of gratitude or coercion. Such questions are convenient distractions designed to keep us debating the choreography of the image rather than confronting the rupture it represents. Because this is what the kiss did. It cut through decades of narrative engineering, years of careful curation by those who need you to believe that Palestinians are subhuman, that their resistance is barbaric, that the land from which they are being erased was never truly theirs to begin with. The kiss did not fit the script. The hostage was meant to be cowering, not embracing. He was meant to be in the hands of monsters, not men, and so the machine sputtered. I have to admit, I'm not entirely convinced that it doesn't matter whether or not the person was coerced. But let's look at how it was sort of covered on Sky at the time. So this was Sky's Diana Magnate reporting the events.
Some amazing scenes today. One of the hostages, you're seeing Omer Shem Tov there, 21 when he was taken from the Nova Music Festival. But just on the side of the screen, we missed it in that vision. But yes, there you can see, I think that is Elijah Cohen kissing the head of his Hamas captor, and waving and cheering. That this is very unexpected to see that kind of reaction, that kind of warmth. But these three obviously absolutely overjoyed that their ordeal, more than 500 days they were in captivity.
The effect of the kiss appears to have angered Israel. Following the handover of the Israeli captives, Israel postponed the agreed release of 620 Palestinian prisoners after what it called, quote, humiliating hostage ceremonies. Among those Palestinians expected to be released was Nael Barghouti, who has been held by Israel for 43 years, longer than any other living captive. Also on the list were several Palestinian journalists who covered the raids of the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. Hamas has denied that the handover ceremonies are humiliating and says Israel is endangering the ceasefire. Negotiations for phase 2 of the deal were supposed to begin in early February, but have not happened so far. And with phase 1 drawing to an end in the next week, the families and supporters of the roughly 30 Israeli captives still thought to be alive in Gaza feared time is running out. This is from a rally in Tel Aviv on Sunday night.
We hear there is a proposal for completing phase 2 in a single move. The Americans want to bring everyone home at once, as does the majority of the Israeli public. The hostage families are demanding it. Yet, Israel's government is trying to drag us back into war against the will of the people and in stark opposition to the best interests of the nation.
In further signs that Israel may be attempting to sabotage the fragile peace, its military assault on the West Bank has intensified. For the first time in more than 20 years, Israel has sent tanks into the occupied West Bank, stationing troops on the outskirts of the city of Jenin. The last time Israeli tanks were in the area was during 2002's Second Intifada. As part of Israel's Operation Iron Wall, launched in January, more than 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced from their homes in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli army has also imposed curfews for days on end, blocked access points to towns, arrested people and commandeered homes for military use. Gary Stevenson has been on Piers Morgan with US right-winger Dave Rubin. Let's have a look.
I got paid millions of dollars a year to bet on the collapse of your working class, okay? I've walked away to come here on this show for free because I want to tell the public, the American people, this gets worse.
Now, you know Gary Stevenson, you know what he argues for. He thinks rising inequality is making poor people poorer because rich people get to buy up all the assets. And he wants to tax billionaires to try and correct that. Now, we won't show him making that argument all over again. You can watch his brilliant interviews on Downstream where he goes into his thesis in detail. Let's, though, look at how he responded to a challenge from Piers Morgan.
If you know your history, can you point to a period in UK history, for example, where massively punishing rich people by massively taxing them has actually benefited the country?
Listen,
because I can't really.
My dad was born in 57. He worked for the post office, Royal Mail, 35 years. Never once earned more than the average wage in the country. He was able to buy a house, support a family. My parents are retired now. They own their own property. They're financially secure. That's not possible now. He lived in an era where the top rate of tax was much, much, much higher. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s in the UK, in the US, the top rate of tax on large estates was significantly higher. And in that time period, it's not a coincidence, ordinary people could afford to buy houses.
It's such a good argument, right? Because also it seemed to be a surprise to Piers Morgan. It's so obvious that sort of like working class people did have it better when it came to how much of the nation's resources they could access when there were very high taxes on the rich. And that's not only because that money was able to be spent on redistribution and social services and the like, but this is the real key point of that Gary makes, and that I think he's sort of, in a way has uniquely put on the agenda, which is the very fact of inequality, the very fact of not taxing the super rich means they will invest their money in the kind of assets that we would like for ourselves, as not super rich people. So if you allow the rich to get very rich, they'll compete with you for houses and the like. Dave Rubin, who Gary was on with, is a right-wing YouTuber. He's a big supporter of Donald Trump. He's against tax increases, as you'd imagine. He also wants smaller government, so he's a big fan of Doge and Elon Musk. Let's see how the debate played out.
What I'm talking about is creating the conditions that will allow people to live a life that they want to live and work a job that gives
of the 50s.
Well, no,
the conditions of the 60s.
So your solution, I completely disagree with, which is, let's just take more from those people. They have too much, and if we only give it to the government, which whether you're in this country or in my country, I think it's fairly obvious that most of our governments are completely fraudulent and backwards and doing virtually nothing right.
Who's doing the taking? Who's doing the taking? Which group in our society is getting richer? And which group is getting poorer?
So again,
who is doing the taking?
So I accept that the rich are getting richer.
I'm just here to protect my people. I'm just here to protect my people.
I think what you would want to do.
I think we're agreed about the reality. Right, what we're disagreeing about is the solution.
And the solution is get the government out of the way. Stop spending. Stop.
But you think the government should be much more involved?
Let me take you by a hand and lead you through the streets of London. I'll show you something.
But again, that's because your government clearly has done policies, it seems you both are in agreement on that hasn't created the conditions for economic prosperity. You might want to talk about importing people that you then had to put on the dole.
They've been slashing the state for 14 years, boss. They slashed the state, they slashed the state, they slashed the state.
So you think if the state
and now my friends' kids don't have no places to go, they don't have no local services,
if the
police barely exist,
things would be better.
The hospitals aren't working, the schools are shutting down.
I do love Gary Stevenson. A very good way of arguing that, shrinking the state isn't necessarily going to work out better for working people. Well, it's definitely not going to, right? Dave Rubin there is saying, the way you get the country growing is you cut government spending. Gary Stevenson saying, we already tried that for the past 14 years. It didn't go very well, right? By the way, it's also the same argument I think you can make about defund the police, but defunding the state doesn't tend to go very well. Let's look at one more clip. This is the last one we'll show you.
You are absolutely right. I think we can all agree. We have all agreed. You're right. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. So what do we do about this? There is a caveat. There is less child poverty now than there's ever been in the history of the recorded planet. People also, to make you also feel happy, people are living longer than they've ever done in history. They're living healthier because we're curing so many more diseases. Water is a lot cleaner than it's ever been. There are fewer mosquito-type diseases out there killing millions of people than there used to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a very good argument to say that in recorded history, there's never been a better time to be alive. That's why I slightly challenge, I would never say, like you say, you'd never say being poor makes you happy. Of course not. But I've yet to see evidence.
Piers, do you think your viewers are the richest they've ever been? Is that what you're telling me?
No, but I don't. But I think that there's certainly less child poverty statistically
in the US
than there's ever been.
Your average American is
in the West generally. Actually, in the West,
your viewers can make their own opinion of that. I want your viewers to ask themselves: do I feel the richest I've ever been? Because I tell you who's the richest they've ever been: me, and probably you, and probably you, and Donald Trump, and Elon Musk. And in my opinion, what I see, I'm from a poor background.
But I think you're a great example of somebody who's made something of himself. Come from a poor working class background by your own admission, and you turned yourself into the best trader in the world. You're a great example. And yet what you seem to be wanting to do is almost retreat from
I don't want to tax I don't want to tax working people more. Okay? I worked hard to drag my family out of poverty, right? And I paid 50-60% a year tax. At the same time, Duke of Westminster inherits £10 billion, more than 3,000 times what I made, pays nothing. Do you think that's fair?
No.
Do you think that's fair?
No, but again,
so let's change it. Let's tax working people less, your viewers less, and let's tax the billionaires more.
Do you think that's fair? No. Do you think that's fair? No. Then let's change it. Grace, I'm going to bring you in on this. You've gone up against Piers Morgan many times before. I had no doubt that Gary would sort of hold himself well. What did you make of that?
Oh, Gary's so great. Gary's great because he's authentic. He has appeal for the same reason that, someone like Mick Lynch has appeal, which is that he's not going on TV to get clips for social media or to kind of boost his career or any of those things. You see him give his message in a way that that he believes what he's saying. And that's why, I think he's such an asset. I agree with him very much about the wealth tax. I think the campaign that he's a part of, which is a bunch of billionaires, basically millionaires getting together saying, tax us more, please, government. They staged an intervention at Davos to say, governments, please tax us more. I think that's great. What I would say is the pushback against this argument, which is that we're all poor and, our living standards have fallen just because the state has been shrunk, is something that the left gets caught out on a lot for the very same reason as Gary's opponent mentioned there, which is that people hate the government. People hate the government in the US. They hate the government here. Why do they hate the government? Because they absolutely despise politicians of most major parties. Politicians have come in at every election saying, we're going to make life better for you, and utterly failed to change anything. They come in saying we're going to tax the rich, and then they end up just dishing tons of money out to big businesses. People know that government is basically corrupt, and that whilst the shrinking of spending on services that benefit working people is a big factor in what's explained falling living standards over previous years, the issue is not that the state as a whole has shrunk. The state has gotten very big when it comes to giving out money to billionaires and policing climate protests. It's just gotten very small for workers. Why is that? Well, it's because there's an imbalance of power in our society as a whole, not an imbalance of power between states and markets, because the governments are in bed with the CEOs and the financiers. The issue isn't that, there's an imbalance of power between politicians and executives. The issue is that there's an imbalance of power between elites and everyone else, which is why the kind of bigger state messaging, I don't think cuts it as a kind of wholesale narrative. Obviously we need things like a wealth tax, but it has to be part of a broader set of proposals that the left is pushing to say we need to rebalance power in society away from, yes, the executives and the heads of the big banks, but also the politicians that are in their pockets, and pull power back down to you as workers within your organizations by taking on these fuckers, sorry if I'm not allowed to say that, by organizing the labor movement and pulling power down into your communities by taking on these corrupt politicians and, getting out into the streets and taking on this government that's telling you that you're not allowed to protest and is trying to throw you in jail if you try. So yeah, I really like Gary, really rate his style of communicating, really rate his whole vibe. I do think that we need to move beyond this big state, small state messaging and start thinking about these questions of power.
How do you tax wealth? Because, I feel like lots of people are making the argument we should tax wealth. Wealth inequality is out of control. Piketty made it ages ago, didn't he, in that book? And it's very convincing. I agree with Gary Stevenson. But I suppose because it never really comes up as a policy question, because it doesn't really seem like many governments are proposing it. I'm not sure how much sort of work has been done on what it would look like, how it would work. I wonder if you're more on top of this than I am. Are there governments anywhere working on implementing one? Or
I don't know if I'm more on top of it than you are, but there are governments.
I said maybe.
Yeah, that already have this, and there have been in the past more governments that have already had this. Look, the way to think about this is wealth as a stock. This is going to just bear with me for 1 minute, right? You've got a bathtub full of water. That's a stock. And then you have the tap of water dribbling into that bathtub. That's a flow. Now, we tend to levy taxes on flows of income, generally. So when you earn an income from work, you get taxed on that income. When you earn an income from wealth, for example, when you receive dividends because you own shares, you get taxed on that income, on that flow. There are also taxes on wealth that relate to more water coming into the bathtub. So that's like capital gains, for example. That's an increase in the value of the asset that you've had over time. These are all ways of getting around the problem that it's hard to tax a stock. It's hard to levy a tax on the amount of water in the bathtub. It's hard to ascertain the amount of wealth that any one person has and then levy a tax on it. So that's been one reason why people have resisted introducing wealth taxes over the last kind of several decades. The issue is that the wealthy's gotten really good at disguising the flows to avoid the taxes on those flows. So, they've taken some stuff out of the bathtub and channeled it underground into a different bathtub that's, headquartered in the Cayman Islands, where they don't have to pay any tax on it. And then they've, used the trust that they've set up to buy a mansion in London where the beneficial owner is a, shell company in Panama, right? So the argument for a tax on stocks of wealth is that we basically need to get better at assessing how much wealth people actually have, individuals who live in this country and are taxed in this country actually have, which would require a huge organizational and bureaucratic effort, by the way, but it's not impossible. It has been done before and it could have been done again. And then tax those values at, a very small percentage of the total value of that asset. And it's basically a way of capturing all of that wealth that has accrued over this long period of time when the wealthy's become much wealthier and also gotten really good at avoiding taxes on flows.
In case you were worried that was too technical, Dragon Durr says the bathtub analogy is pretty good and fun. So that's some pretty good feedback for explaining the difference between stocks and flows. Of course, disappointing on this when it comes to tax havens is, Biden, for all we might complain about him, he sort of did push forward that idea of having a 15% minimum tax. And one of Trump's first move was to say, not only am I removing the USA from this project, from this agreement, but I'm going to economically punish any country that stays a member of it. So, potentially the Trump administration is going to take us backwards on this question. Grace, it's been so lovely being joined by you. We're going to have to make sure we sort out your audio before next time. I didn't get to know what you thought about
that.
Oh, don't worry.
I left and came back and it did not work. So I'm going to sort that out for next time. I completely apologize to your viewers who are no better than having to deal with this kind of stuff. You guys are such pros.
Well, to be fair, the last time I co-hosted from home, my microphone muted about 5 different times. So everyone in the audience is going to be saying they're not pros at all. But let's go to a super chat. We've got one super chat before we end. Music Man, I mostly agree with Grace's view here. That's my politics, but I appreciate Michael's probing pushback. I don't want to believe things just because they're convenient to me. Scrutiny is useful and important. What a wonderful comment.
I agree. And healthy debate is fun.
Healthy debate is fun. And we won't mute you next time if you're too convincing. Let's wrap up there. Grace Blakeley, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, thank you everyone for watching Novara Live. We'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. Good night.